Hello, this is Video Game Growing Pains, and we are here to talk about Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V is a rather interesting game because, while it was released right after Final Fantasy IV in Japan for the Super Famicom, it was never released for the Super Nintendo in the United States. This was because it was a very text-heavy RPG, and by the time everything could have been localized and all the programming had been done to change the text to English, we would have already been into the PlayStation era. So Squaresoft made the fateful decision to forget about Final Fantasy V and skip to Final Fantasy VI, renaming it Final Fantasy III for its American release. Again, assuming that we Americans were stupid. However, we'll get to that. For now, let's talk about Final Fantasy V. It got a second chance to shine on the PlayStation when Final Fantasy V and VI were released together in the Final Fantasy Anthology Collection. This is the collection I played Final Fantasy V on, and I have to say, I was very surprised by it. After playing Final Fantasies IV and VI, Final Fantasy V was a bit different. It kept some of the sensibilities of Final Fantasy IV, yes, but it took out some of the things which made it unique. The characters didn't have their own unique traits anymore. We went back to a job system that was very similar to Final Fantasy I and III. In fact, Final Fantasy V could be argued to be what Final Fantasy III should have been. It's a much more fleshed out job system with some interesting tweaks that we'll go into. All in all, they took the best of the old and the best of the new and created a very engaging RPG. Not just from a story or character perspective, but from a visual and gameplay perspective as well. We got some of the most unique gameplay we would ever have in Final Fantasy, and Nobuo Uematsu, having fully hit his stride with Final Fantasy IV, delivered some of the best music of the series. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. What is Final Fantasy V? Well, the game starts off with, the elements just sort of crapping out. The wind suddenly stopped blowing. Fire is beginning to lose its heat. Water is becoming impure. The elements are dying. And in the midst of this, a traveler named Bart is, he basically has a meteor fall right on top of him. And from this meteor, he meets a young princess and an old man. And together, he ends up joining them on their quest. It's a bit of an odd coincidence which they all get together. You see, Bart's is originally after the princess, Reina, to help her find her father. And the warrior, Galuf, ends up joining them because their quests line up. Along the way, they also meet a tomboyish pirate, Faris, and they sort of get enlisted by the crystals themselves and the ghost of Reina's father to help save the world from an impending darkness that threatens to consume it. And once the crystals are shattered, yes, the crystals get shattered, this is not big spoilers, but once they get shattered, the shards grant job classes to our four heroes. This was something very interesting, because not only could you choose job classes a la Final Fantasy III, but you got the ability to mix and match. What do I mean by that? Well, think back to Final Fantasy IV. We had the basic commands. We had fight, defend, we had item. However, they also had a special command. Every character had a special command. While characters don't have their unique commands in Final Fantasy V, every job class has a special command. And you have an extra space in your hero list. When you're giving commands, you can choose to take commands from an old job and add it to a new job. So you could literally have a paladin who could throw black magic, or a priest who is skilled in the use of swords. You could do more than just give new commands, though. You could choose how you counterattacked. You could choose support abilities that gave you unique skills. And all of this could be mixed and matched together to create some very interesting combinations. More than that, though, we got some very fresh classes. Final Fantasy III had some very standard classes. We had our knights and our wizards. We had a few interesting ones, like summoners and paladins. But in Final Fantasy V, we got sorcerers, who were basically mage knights. We got blue mages. We got hunters, bards, geomancers. So many interesting classes. And all of these could be mixed and matched together. And some of the combinations you could create were amazing. This is what made the battle system shine. It was the same active time battle system from Final Fantasy IV, where speed was key. However, you could mix and match different commands to create a party that was very specialized, very unbalanced, or just very random. a lot of skills were quite random and hard to predict. Now, naturally, you could also choose classes specifically to deal with boss encounters. Early on in the game, it's recommended that you become monks because they aren't required to have weapons and they do a lot of damage barehanded. But later on in the game, if you haven't been training up job skills, yes, you learn skills because each job gains experience, as you do. So we have character experience and job experience. As I was saying, later on in the game, if you don't have the skills, you would easily be outclassed. So that's the battle system. It was brilliant, it was an evolution of Final Fantasy III, and it kept some of the good sensibilities of Final Fantasy IV. Now, the story, as I've told it, sounds very stock. However, we have a lot of twists and turns coming around. And though we only have 4 characters as opposed to the large cast of Final Fantasy IV, they do a lot with them. We get to learn about their pasts, Bartz himself having a very unique tie to Galuf that you wouldn't expect. Galuf has amnesia, and certain times this plays into his story. At one point, the entire party is entranced by a siren, but Galuf sees an image of a young girl. And since he doesn't know who she is, he isn't affected by the siren's song. It's very different from what you would expect of the typical amnesia trope, or from your typical RPG stories. They might seem like blank slates, but these characters had so much depth to them. Reyna and Ferret, in particular, sharing a rather interesting secret that gets revealed later on. Now, the story itself was supported by some truly memorable side characters. We had, of course, Cid, but we also had Cid's grandson, Mid. Actually, I think he might have been its nephew. Either way, we had Cid and Mid. Yes, you were being very cute, Final Fantasy V. But we also had some very fun villains. The standout is Gilgamesh. He is one of the main leaders of the evil army, who you will meet in the Second World. Yes, we have multiple worlds. Isn't life fun? And we have Exdeath. Both of these characters got much more fleshed out in future Final Fantasies and in side stories, as sub-bosses and as their own little stories, but they had some very interesting quirks. Gilgamesh was an enemy who ran from you. And not only that, but he was known for being a sword hunter. At one point, he thinks he has the greatest sword, and it does 1 damage to you. Oh, that wacky Gilgamesh. And you have Exdeath, the main baddie. He's a very different villain from the ones we've seen before. He doesn't hesitate to just completely destroy you himself. And though his hubris is what ultimately saves the party in many occasions, he's a very interesting villain for other reasons. He's somewhat of a nihilist. He wants everything to return to nothing and to take the power of nothingness. And the history behind Exdeath is quite unique as far as villains go. Plus, we get some really great battle scenes, not just between Exdeath and the heroes, but Exdeath at one point fights a turtle sage. And I don't mean a person. He fights a turtle, who is a sage. And it's amazing. We get a lot of interesting story bits in Final Fantasy V, and I was quite amazed at it when I first played it. Now, it is sort of a completionist's nightmare, because getting all of the job classes maxed out will take ages, but unlike the other Final Fantasies, you don't really need to grind as much, because if you're having trouble with a particular section, just change jobs. It makes it harder to level up certain jobs, yes, but it was a very nice tweak. The music was just gorgeous. We had some of the most somber and memorable tunes ever heard. Uematsu's Dear Friends or the Music Box theme are some of the most heartbreakingly beautiful I've heard since Final Fantasies 4 and 6. Some of my favorite music ever. One thing I haven't talked about, the graphics. While it was a minor step up from Final Fantasy 4, it wasn't a great deal. They did add some nice tweaks, such as characters' appearance could change in battle. All the weapons had unique appearances, and every job class that you took had a unique armor look for your characters, so they weren't all just palette swaps. This was very nice. It gave the characters a unique feel in combat, like every class was different for every character. However, the graphics were not all that impressive compared to the major leap from Final Fantasies 3 to 4. Still, they were very nice. We still have the same expressive sprites, and they try and be a bit more adventurous with the characters. You'll have more of the characters jumping around and fighting outside of combat with just their sprites bouncing around the screen. Very interesting, but a little silly if you just stop and think about it. We also got some evolutions in how things would work outside of battle and inside of battle. a lot of the skills you could get would be useful outside of combat. You could, for example, poach certain monsters to get, well, items that might help you. You could mix potions as a chemist, and that would help you create new items in battle. And some of the summons didn't just do damage, but would actually protect you. The most notable ones being Carbuncle and Golem. Carbuncle creates a wall of reflection against magic, and Golem protects you from physical attacks. And once again, the battle system is used to tell a story. Now, the one thing I haven't talked about with Final Fantasy V, having gotten graphics, music, and gameplay out of the way, is the final leg of the game. While it's not quite a meat grinder as Final Fantasy IV was, even on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy V could get a little tedious towards the end. You are charged with collecting 12 legendary weapons near the end of the game. Many of these you will never use because they are like the Earth Bell or Yaoichi's Bow. If you haven't trained to be a hunter or a geomancer, they mean nothing to you. And after we get all of these, we go through a marathon of a good 3 to 5 dungeons, depending on how you divide them, with a lot of bosses who seem like they should be important, but kind of aren't. We do get some interesting boss fights, I'll say that, including one of the more easy, but also one of the more interesting bosses who, if you're floating, because you can float in this game, he will pretty much be unable to touch you. Very interesting stuff. And we get actually a tearful farewell with Gilgamesh. But like I was saying, the last, I would say, 3 to 7 hours of the game, depending on how strong and how quick you are, is an incredible slog. It starts to lose its momentum after World 2. I'm not going to tell you how many worlds there are. Let's leave that as a surprise. However, that aside, there's not a lot wrong with Final Fantasy V. It is, like I said, a completionist nightmare because there's so much to do and so much to keep account for. How many jobs you've mastered, what you can do with all of your skills, but it also adds an incredible amount of depth to the gameplay, and I appreciate that. Final Fantasy V overall is one of my favorites in the series. It's got a very nice story that's a nice departure from what we might call the standard tropes. Our amnesiac actually uses amnesia to help us rather than be a plot device. There's some genuine twists and turns, and we get to meet some very fun villains. However, I can't deny that I got very tired of it near the end. But if that's the only problem, that it's running just a little too long, I'd say the series is doing pretty well. We get a lot of varied locations with the game, we get great music, and we get a very innovative, very fun battle system. Even today, there's a reason why people keep reusing the job system and allowing people to mix and match jobs. It was fun! Alright, having talked about Final Fantasy V, let's move on to what I think is the best Final Fantasy game ever. Maybe not necessarily my favorite, but what I believe in my heart to be the best of all the Final Fantasies. This is where we hit the pinnacle of Uematsu and Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man behind the series, where we reach the peak of their genius. The best Final Fantasy is coming up next time. Final Fantasy VI, everyone. See you soon.